Why do we want to get better? Because we don't want something bad to happen. That's the big thing. Because we've got evidence of things that can go wrong when you don't take water seriously in the right way. So we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson. And you're thinking, great, I came out in the snow for a history lesson. But hopefully this isn't too overwhelming. We're going to go back to the 1800s. This is London, England. London's a tough spot to live in at the time. You've got a lot of people living in one area. It's filthy. You've got slaughterhouses on the same road as a daycare. You don't have plumbing. You don't have the right infrastructure. If you're going to the bathroom, you're going to the corner of your house, probably squatting in the corner, and you've got a cesspool under your floor that's dealing with your waste. So it's horrible. It's a tough spot to live. It gets even tougher when all of a sudden there's a cholera outbreak. The government at the time is noticing a lot of people are getting sick. A lot of people are showing up at the hospitals. Something must be the matter. But no one knew why. There's 616 people dead as a result of this outbreak. But why? At the time, government officials had thought there are these particles in the air called miasma. These little things. The air is really bad already. You can see it. You step outside your door. It's filthy. That's what's making us sick. We have cholera because of the dirty air. But there was someone by the name of Dr. John Snow. So he was a physician. He lived in London. He was noticing a lot of people getting sick with cholera. Seemed to have something in common. They were coming from the same family, from the same part of town, from the same neighborhood. They all seemed to be in one area. So he made a map of the city, and he started putting pins in it to say, this person passed away, this person is sick. He noticed a big cluster of people, and they all happened to be around this one pump in Broad Street. So there was a well there. What they didn't know at the time of the cholera outbreak was that that well was pretty shallow, and it was under the influence from a cesspool that was just a few feet away. So there was a mom who had a baby, and she was changing the baby's diapers, so just washing the feces into the cesspool. That baby had cholera, and it contaminated the well. So you've got this well. Everyone in the community comes to that well because it looks clean. It's clean-looking water. It's a great source of water compared to what you would find in the River Thames. That's dirty, that's filthy. Don't get your water from there. Look at it. Go to the well. But the well was contaminated. John Snow goes on a bit of a path. He has some convincing to do. All the government officials say, no, it's the dirty air. We already know that's what's making people sick. And he's saying, now look at the map. It's all around this neighborhood. Let me try something. They knock the well handle off. People can't use that particular pump anymore. All of a sudden, the outbreak drops off. So it's the first time in history that someone recognized the water, even in an urban setting, even if it looks clean, maybe that could be a problem. It's the source of the outbreak. There's big changes as a result. The government realizes there are things in the water. Even when the water looks clean, we've got to do something about it. We've got to make sure that we don't let all this filth, all the cesspools, all that can't be close to the water we drink. We got to move it somewhere else. They get really good at sanitation. We get the first sewer systems in an urban setting in Europe. That migrates its way over to America. We see big drops in the outbreaks of things like cholera. The government's involved in letting people know when there are outbreaks, that the water's a problem, boil your water. It's government intervention to keep people safe. Up until now, this really didn't happen in water. It was just step back, water looks clean, they drink it. So we're getting better at sanitation. This is Dr. Crapper. He's not the founder or the inventor of the toilet, but he's a big reason why it became popular. He spread the usefulness of pooping in a toilet and moving it somewhere else. So that spreads across Europe. Dr. Crapper is largely the reason why we have better sanitation, even in here in North America, because it came from England, we adopted it here. Now, in the early 1900s, we're still seeing outbreaks. People are still getting sick sometimes. And this is Henrietta Chick. She's credited with one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the last 150 years. Surprisingly, very few people know who Dr. Chick is. She's the first person to ever identify the right balance between a disinfectant's strength, so the amount of disinfectant, and the amount of time it has to work on some sort of risk, something in the water that can make someone sick. She's the first person to figure out there's a balance between put the right amount in for the right amount of time, and you can make people safe. Up until then, if you were disinfecting with chemicals, it was largely haphazard. There was no real plan. So Henrietta is the first person to ever figure this out. And we still use this concept today. We'll talk about it with our disinfection presentation a little bit later. But we have a concentration of something that's going to disinfect, gets the right amount of time, the CT factor, as some of you are aware. So Henrietta comes up with this discovery. It's a revolution. It changes the way we operate our cities, because up until now, there were still outbreaks. We still had typhoid and dysentery. You cluster people in one area, people tend to be filthy, they contaminate water supplies, populations never get a chance to thrive. When we get better at disinfecting our water, we eliminate these waterborne disease outbreaks for the most part, and population skyrockets. You get cities popping up all over America. Canada grows, their populations start to get stronger. We're not dying off at young ages anymore. And what happens is, time passes. This is like the 1900s, Henrietta discovers the benefits of disinfection. Chlorine's implemented in Milwaukee and some bigger cities in the States. 50, 60 years, but still every once in a while, there's an outbreak. People get sick. We're still not perfect at keeping water and people safe. So, if you were to look back between the 70s and 2002, in 2002 there's a big thing that happens, and we're going to look at it. But between the 70s and 2002, you've got 73 waterborne disease outbreaks in North America, Canada and the US. So those outbreaks, you can't really put your finger on exactly what it was about the system, because some of them were surface water, some of them are groundwater. There's a tendency to always think groundwater is safer, but groundwater outbreaks, they still happen. Some of the time, it was a system where they weren't treating the water, so you're probably going to have a problem eventually. Some of them had chlorination and other forms of disinfection. Sometimes it was a result of equipment failing. Sometimes it was heavy rains, sewage contamination. There's a bunch of reasons. So you can't always say, oh, there's a problem because it's a bog hole and they don't disinfect. Because there's lots of scenarios where things seem good, but then there's an outbreak. And why is that? Well, a lot of the times when water is contaminated, maybe you look at it and you think, I wouldn't drink that. It's not going to be something that looks appealing. Maybe it's cloudy, it's dirty, it's obvious that maybe there's something going on in that water. Many times in our big cities and in our small towns, the water that we drink, even if it's contaminated with small invisible pathogens, it looks clean. So you could drink it, think that it's fine, but there's a risk inside the water. In Newfoundland, a lot of us are familiar with something called Giardia. That's a parasite that lives inside the small intestines. It's really resilient, so it contaminates the inside of someone's intestines. You go to the bathroom, your feces contains the cysts of Giardia. It can live for weeks and months, even in cold conditions and in wet, freezing conditions. It survives. It's looking for a new host. So eventually, you would only have to drink water containing 10 cysts of Giardia to get sick. So you basically poop out thousands and thousands of cysts, and if only a few make it to the system and then you drink them, you end up with severe diarrhea, vomiting, and a lot of cramping. It's not like having a really, really bad flu. That's another part of the problem, and we'll see that. Things with these contaminations just kind of seem regular. It seems like maybe you've got food poisoning, maybe you've got the flu. E. coli is a bit of the same. So it's a fecal coliform bacteria. It's really common in the intestines of animals and humans. Most of it is fine. But there is a version of E. coli, and a lot of us are familiar with it, 015787. A lot of times it's in cattle. And if that E. coli makes its way into the human system, it can pose a really big threat, because it's going to lead to diarrhea and cramping. It's going to eventually lead to kidney failure in a lot of people. And children and the elderly aren't very resilient to that kind of strain on the body. It takes a lot of toll, all that dehydration and diarrhea. So the children and the elderly are at risk. So we have these invisible things that can show up in the water. Water can look clean. And as a result, we tend to be complacent in a lot of scenarios. Water problems exist. The water still looks good. It's not a big problem. Maybe some people get sick, but it seems like the flu. A lot of time passes, nobody acts. So it's complacency that shows up in every single one of those outbreaks between the 70s and the 2000s in North America. In every scenario, there's some aspect of it where somebody didn't act at the right time. And we're trying to change that. We want to act when we see a problem. So if we go back to the 90s, this is Milwaukee. This is a big city. There's millions of people relying on Lake Michigan for the water. This was a system. They knew that when there's a spring storm, like in a lot of small communities, you use a small pond or bog hole. Spring storm rolls through, the water's going to get really turbid. Doesn't look all that good, but the spring storm usually passes and water goes back to being clean. In 1993, there was an event where, because of a lot of surrounding potentials for contamination around Lake Michigan, it was contaminated by Cryptosporidium, another kind of parasite, an invisible parasite. 400,000 people were infected with Cryptosporidium. Like the other ones, you get a lot of that stomach cramping, diarrhea, and fever. 100 people died. A lot of them the elderly and the little ones, the small people. One of the most outrageous parts of Milwaukee, it's a big system. Maybe they do have a lot of challenges managing a system that supplies water to millions of people. They knew there were problems in that water system in mid-March. So the operator of the system, the technical person, was observing, water quality's not looking good, something seems to happen with the storm, maybe the equipment's not great. In the hospitals, they were noticing a lot of people. There's hundreds of thousands of people infected. Hospitals are getting full up with people who seem to have something like a fever. In the community, they go out and they start looking for the problem. It's probably not water, let's look at the restaurants. They start going around, checking all these restaurants. Did someone eat some food that was contaminated? Why are all these people sick? Are they going to one restaurant? The person who managed the water system was in an office building on the same floor as the person who managed all the hospitals. They had doors that were basically from here to that table. They worked basically side by side, day to day, over a long period of time. They would have lunch together. They would have talks about all sorts of things. They never took an opportunity to get together to say, yeah, our water system's not great right now. And the person who ran the hospital would say, well, I've got hundreds of thousands of people showing up sick, and a lot of people are dying. They never had that conversation to say, whoa, do you think they're connected? So they had a breakdown in their managerial capacity, their technical capacity. They weren't communicating when there's problems. The person running the technical system kept all that to himself. He wasn't reaching out to anyone to say, maybe there's a problem, could something go wrong here? So you didn't get a boil water advisory issued until many months. So you had all that time for people to get sick. This event could have happened. Spring storm, system's not working well. The technical person says, I've got a problem, I'll reach out. We need a boil water advisory. Okay, people stay safe. There's a bit of a path there. It's when things linger and you get complacent that you get big problems. Probably a lot of you are familiar with Walkerton. So in Walkerton, this is the year 2000. It's a pretty small community in Ontario, if you're not familiar with it. It's got, I think it's about 5,000 people at the time were using 3 wells. They didn't realize one of those wells was something called a groundwater under direct influence well. So if something was to happen on the surface, this well wasn't totally isolated from that occurrence on the surface. In May, things were pretty good. It was a normal spring in Ontario. All of a sudden, over a few days, there's a lot of rain. So a rainstorm rolls through Ontario. Walkerton, it's really wet for a few days. Then the sun comes back out, everything's back to normal. They didn't realize that heavy rains had washed cattle manure into this well. So this well had an opportunity to be contaminated. Because of this weather event, it was contaminated. So over the course of May 12th to 15th, residents were exposed to E. coli. So we talked about E. coli. If you get contaminated, you're probably going to face some consequences. the time chlorine dose was low. Now we've got a bit of a timeline. So it rained. 3 days after the rain, the Waterbourne Commission, the group who's responsible with running the technical system, they do a routine water supply sample. They get the results back from the lab on May 17th. So remember now, we've had a spring rainstorm. There's a threat goes out in the system. People are being exposed to that threat. Time has passed. The Public Utilities Commission, they get a fax from the lab saying there is E. coli in that water. But the operators don't do anything. They keep that information to themselves. They ignore the facts, or they just think it's not important enough. And the first people in the community are starting to get sick now. They're showing up at the hospital. They've got those flu-like symptoms. May 19th, we're about like a week after the rains now. The Waterbourne, the Utility Commission says to other officials in the community, don't worry, the water's safe. Because they're starting to notice people are showing up at the hospital, and some of the health officials are saying, what's the problem here? They're going out and looking again at the restaurants, the food supplies. Where's this contamination coming from? The May 20th, 40 people are in hospital with bloody diarrhea. So this is a pretty nasty infection. Whatever it is, maybe this isn't just like the flu. Maybe it's not just the food, but all the people who run the water system say everything's okay. Again, they said to the health officials, water's fine. They're not ever mentioning that there was a fax saying there was E. coli in the water. 21st, you got more people sick. The health officials say there's so many people sick now in a community of 7,000 or 5,000. You've got thousands are sick. Like half the community is sick. This must be something more than just food. We don't have the proof of that, but let's put on a boil water advisory just in case. They do their own sampling. They find out, yeah, there's E. coli in the water. And they find out about that old fax that came in to the people who are running the system. So by the time things wrap up in Waterbourne, 2,300 people get sick, 65 are hospitalized, and 7 died, and they were elderly and infants. There's a lot of failures in Waterbourne, and a lot of failures that eventually we learned from. There was the operator level. Some of these guys, they're 2 brothers, the Coble brothers. They weren't really trained. They didn't really understand the importance of what they were doing. They acted in ways that maybe weren't appropriate too, and there's a legal side of this story we won't get into, but there was a consequence for them in not behaving in the right way, maybe not knowing what to do themselves. The people who were in charge of those guys, maybe they put too much faith in those people. They knew they didn't have the right amount of training, but they were okay with it. There was cutbacks at the government level. There wasn't enough training across all of Ontario. There was people at the hospital who maybe earlier on should have reached out to other people in government to say, we've got a bit of a problem in our small town. So you get a lot of failures. Consequently, in Waterbourne, if you say Waterbourne in Ontario, and I worked on boil water advisories in Ontario, you say Waterbourne, it's dirty water. Waterbourne's got clean water now. A lot of time has passed since the year 2000, but it's synonymous in small towns with that's where water was bad and it killed a lot of people. They're going to have a hard time shaking that stigma. They've done a lot to improve the perception of Waterbourne. They've done a lot of great things in Waterbourne, but that stigma lingers. In the community, you've got months passing before boil water advisory was lifted. Schools were closed. Property values dropped. There wasn't much tourism. People didn't want to go there anymore. There's millions in lost revenue for the community. So there's a health impact and there's a financial impact. And I've seen that in a lot of cases. It's not just some people get sick. Communities have a hard time recovering from these outbreaks. Right after Waterbourne, it happens again. This is Saskatchewan. This is North Battleford, Saskatchewan. Pretty small community again, at least for Canadian standards. You've got an intake to a water system where for years they've known there's trouble. It was taking in water at a point where their sewage treatment was just upstream. Close enough that they said, maybe we should change the location of that intake, but they didn't. They've known about it for a while, but they don't act. So there's an event. Again, a lot of people get sick, thousands of people. The people who do get infected have that high fever and diarrhea again. A lot of them are children. And at the time of the outbreak, there is a class action lawsuit against the city where they say, You knew about this problem for a long time and you didn't act on it. People got sick, so they were sued, and they were successfully sued by the residents of the community for millions of dollars. In 2017, 2018, there's another class action lawsuit against the community. So it's almost 2 decades after, and the people at the time who were under the age of 18 who couldn't protect themselves came back and said, you should have protected me, but you didn't. So they're suing them again. So they're going to deal with that for a long time. That's a lingering outcome of not taking the right steps at the right time. Here in Newfoundland, there's a history of some outbreaks. We have some communities where there were occurrences like there was an infection of Giardia, 136 people get sick. You've got not the same scale as some of these bigger communities, but people do get sick. Some time passes, and eventually we get to the 2000s. We still have a couple of events like Walkerton and North Battleford, the rest of the country, still seeing this, people getting sick over and over, drinking water. And then in 2002, things drop off. We've had Walkerton, we've had North Battleford, things are starting to change. And we're going to talk about that today as part of the protection system and the multi-barriers that were introduced as a result of these failures and what we learned from them. So one of the things that, if you're a government official and you want to remind people in these communities, or if you're a community member who wants to communicate to other residents in the community, when you get sick from drinking contaminated water, it's usually just like the flu. It's not much different. It's really easy to think, I'm just sick again. I'm not going to go to the doctor, even if you're severely sick. So they figure only a few people who ever get sick from drinking contaminated water will make their way to the doctor. If even a few people in a really big city go to the doctor, that could be hundreds of thousands of people. It's really easy, nowadays at least, with the way we improved the multi-barrier system, to say there's a lot of people sick, probably there's something wrong with the water. In a small community, if a quarter of the population gets sick and only one person ever makes its way to a doctor to say, I don't feel so good, I think I might have drank contaminated water, you're probably not going to investigate an outbreak. And this is something that can happen repeatedly in a certain scenario. Someone gets sick, water goes back to normal. Nothing ever changes in the system. So for every one reported case in Canada and here in Newfoundland, there's probably hundreds of other people. In some communities, they tend to say, we never get sick from drinking this water. Well, and when we think about that aspect, a lot of times there's a breakdown in communication where the right information isn't being relayed to the residents of the community. We saw that in Steady Brook a few years ago. This is a scenario where a particular person was using a roadside spring. And a lot of you probably here in the government or even in your community know of a location where people go to drink water that comes out of who knows where, but it looks clean and people love it. They love it more than water that has chlorine in it because it tastes better and it looks better. What they're forgetting is that water has no disinfection. Who knows what activity has been happening upstream of the point where you're taking a cup of water. So in this scenario, Steady Brook woman's going for years so the water looks better. She gets sick. So sick that she loses a lot of weight. She's in and out of the hospital. She's talking to doctors. We were on the West Coast recently and we learned a little bit more about this scenario. More people were in the hospital. There's 5 or 6, I think, reported cases where people were showing up to the hospital. It makes its way to the news. This woman drank from this spring. She got sick. The same day that the news story is out, the reporters are at this roadside spring and there's people there still drinking from it. And they're kind of saying, do you know that she got sick? And they're saying, well, I like the taste of the water from here better than the water from my community. So it's got to be safer. So there's a lack of communication. We want to improve communication, let people know that that can't possibly be safe. It looks clean, but it's not safe. Particularly if they're going back, taking that water from the spring and giving it to their kids, giving it to their grandma for a cup of tea, brushing their teeth. You can't keep people safe that way. You want to show them there's a benefit if you're on a boil water advisory of improving your system, making that water better through disinfection than ever relying on the roadside spring. But now we have a little bit of a break for coffee.